It's time to begin our class this evening. We're on continuing our study in Genesis. We're on the beginning of Joseph's rise to power. If you don't have a copy of this lesson, there's some in the back. You can go and get a copy of that. It's on the back podium as you walk into the auditorium. So appreciate everyone coming out this evening. And before we get started, let's go to God. Dear God and Father, we are humble. We're thankful that we can come into your presence. We're thankful for the opportunities that we have to worship and serve you. We are thankful for this time that we can have to meditate and study upon your word. We just pray your richest blessings upon us as we read and learn more about the faith of those patriarchs, and we just pray that we would be strengthened and encouraged and uplifted. We pray, Lord, that you would be with us as we continue to give reverence and respect to your word and the truth of this gospel. And we just pray, Lord, that you would help us to grow in our zeal and in our determination to do your will. We pray, Lord, that you would bless us all as we continue to labor and serve in this community, and that you be with all the classes and teachers, that much good will be done tonight. We just pray your blessings upon us. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. If you will turn to Genesis chapter 40. That's where we're going to start in just a minute. We just came out of Memorial Day weekend, and if we think about that for a little bit, we think about World War I. There was 110,000 men that died in that battle. In World War II, there was 405,000. In the Civil War, there was 625,000 that had died in those battles. And we just came out of Memorial Day weekend, and that was a time to remember them and to reflect upon their sacrifices. And it's easy to forget about, the benefits that we have from the sacrifices of those of the past, because of our busy lives. I mean, we have, a lot of things going on, and we have work, we have family, we have a lot of things that we get wrapped into, and those folks tend to be underappreciated and underrecognized, and we just kind of forget about it. Well, that's what we're going to see with Joseph, the forgotten. He was in prison for 2 years. Forgotten. And we'll see more about that. And hopefully we can learn the great faith that we can see in Joseph and how that can apply to our lives as well. Not only was he forgotten, but we're going to see in our lesson that he became a statesman. He rose from prison to basically the second command in Egypt. And so a great testimony to Joseph, but the one thing that we shouldn't lose sight of in all of this that we talk about this evening is the providence of God. And hopefully we'll see that in the life of Joseph. When we think about all the things that happened to Joseph, and the prison, and the roller coaster ride that he was on, it was all a part of God's plan. And God made this happen for what ultimate purpose? To establish the nation of Israel. To fulfill his promise that he made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And so that's what we want to see here as we think about this example of Joseph and what we can learn from him. If we go back to Genesis 37 and through 39, where do we leave Joseph? Where was he at? What happened? What's that?
In prison.
he was in prison. But if we go back even further, in his father's house, what happened?
His brothers sold him into slavery.
Okay.
I mean, that's how he got to Egypt. Was they conspired to kill him. Reuben talked them out of killing them. They threw him in a pit. Reuben thought he was going to be able to come and save Joseph and return him, restore him to his father. And while Reuben was away, the other brothers sold him into slavery. And we just see this continuing chain of events that leads to him being put in prison. And through most of that, it's, being sold into slavery was not because he did something wrong. Being put in prison was not because he did something wrong. And we just see this continuation of events that gets him where he needs to be, but not because he was doing the right things. Or not because he was doing the wrong things, but the wrong things were still happening.
He was a dreamer. Remember that? He had this dream, and his brothers became jealous, and they threw him in the pit, as Dwayne said. And so there was deceit in the house of Jacob. What was Jacob's name? Jacob, what does it mean?
Who grabs at their heel, or the deceit?
Supplanter. The one who deceived people ended up being deceived in the end. And then what was it like for Jacob, Joseph's father? I mean, how did he react? There was despair, and as any father or parent would have. So we learned that back in Genesis chapter 37, and then we see the faithful servant there in Genesis chapter 39, when Joseph was sold into Egyptian slavery, and he became basically the head of the household of the chief executioner, Potiphar, of Egypt. And so we learn more about his service. What kind of servant was he in that household? He prospered. Everything that he did well. To the point that everything that Potiphar had, he was in charge of. And so we learn more about his service and the type of person he is. We learn about his self-control. What do we learn about him in terms of self-control? What about Potiphar's wife?
More than once, he resisted her.
More than once, yeah. And he said, how can I do this sin against God? And so we learned that he had this self-control. We learned that he had to endure sufferings. Because as a result, he was falsely accused and he was thrown in prison, which is where we find Joseph in our study this evening. So let's look at Genesis chapter 40, and let's read a few verses here. It says, in Genesis 40, verse 1, it says, sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined to prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with them in his custody in the master's house, why are your faces downcast? They said to him, we have had dreams. There is no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. So we read a few verses here. Let's get some thoughts or ideas about some of the things that we can learn here. When we think about the cupbearer and the baker, and how their lives intersected with Joseph, what do we learn from this reading here? How did they interconnect? How'd they come together?
They're all in prison together.
Okay. Was it just accident? Was it just happenstance? How do these things happen? What do you think?
We said Potiphar was the captain of the guard, right?
Yeah.
The chief executioner. And so it would make sense that where Joseph was put into prison, that the Pharaoh's servants would also be put into prison in that same place. It seemed that way. But I think what you're looking at is, again, the word you used earlier, providence, right? That God had planned for this to happen.
Okay. You remember going back to Genesis chapter 37 when Joseph had his dreams. Here these two had their dreams. And they didn't know what they meant. So now we can see how they interconnect these dreams and Joseph's ability to use the power of God to be able to interpret these dreams. This is the key intersection point. We think about the cupbearer. What's kind of the function or role of a cupbearer? You remember Nehemiah was a cupbearer. Yep.
I believe they basically taste it before the king drinks it to make sure that it's not poison.
Yeah, okay. The chief baker was pretty obvious, right? The head chef, whatever we want to call him. And so there was certainly a very important function there with those two positions. There was power. I mean, we don't know what happened with the cupbearer and the baker, why they were thrown in prison. All it tells us is that they committed an offense. But we find them being thrown into prison. I don't know if the cupbearer spit in the king's food, or if the baker burned the biscuits, or I don't know. We don't know. We're not told. But they were thrown into prison because of an offense. And so we see this intersecting point here with the dreams that brought them together in the interpretation. We clearly see the providence of God at work here. With these two being thrown into prison, Joseph being there, it was not an accident. God used it as an opportunity to continue to work his plan in Joseph's life. Any other thoughts or comments on that? We'll move on. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
The other point that shows God's providence is in Potiphar's anger, he threw him in prison, but in God's work, he put Joseph in good favor with the chief ruler of the prison, the person who had charge of the prison. And that guy just put Joseph in charge. It said he didn't have to do this. The Bible says he didn't do anything else because Joseph took care of everything
Yeah.
from that on.
And
So they're in the prison. Here's the cupbearer and the baker, but Joseph's in charge of them.
yeah, and that's a good point. If we think about Joseph's life, I mean, he obviously prospered in the house of Potiphar, but he also prospered when he was in prison. He prospered no matter where he was at, whatever the circumstances were. He was able to prosper, and we'll learn later that all that prosperity with Joseph, he recognizes and gives credit to God. And so let's think about this for just a minute. If we look at Genesis chapter 40 and verse 8, the verse that we read, it talks about Joseph saying to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." When we think about this statement that Joseph mentioned, what do we learn about that from Joseph? Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
Well, that's his father didn't have this capability, evidently, because he made some wrong decisions. Yet though Joseph here seems to grasp hold of being more godly than his father was. And that's very strange.
Of course, as we go fast forward into the book of Hebrews, Jacob is mentioned as one of those heroes of faith, right? So we certainly see that. And we see that faith being passed on even into Joseph. In this statement here, who's he crediting? God. He says God will give the interpretation. So what does that say about Joseph's faith? Where did it come from?
Did anyone ever tell you a dream? And what does it mean, Alan? If dreams are meant to be explained by the Bible or by God, dreams have a purpose. I don't have dreams. So that's,
But God was able to use this situation in order to further His plan.
well, it's just, you know, it's more being like God. I mean, it's really fantastic to have a different mind and be able to dream and then make it realistic.
Yeah.
That's
So Joseph had this faith. He must have understood or had some knowledge of the promise that God made to Abraham and that passed on to Isaac and Jacob, his father. He must have been familiar with that and had faith in God, His promises, His protection, all these things built up his faith. Casey, I think you had a comment.
I was basically going to say what you just said. Not only did he have faith in God, but he had his faith in his standing with God. For them to be able to say to him their dreams and him feel confident that he would be able to be God's instrument.
Yeah. And so to trust in God's promises, that's faith-filled. When we start looking at all the promises that God made, and when we look at this lesson today, we think about the promise God made to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and on through the lineage. And the fulfillment of that promise, we can see that. But when it was made to Abraham, it was not fulfilled. It was just a promise. It did not come to pass. And now we can look back and see that. And we can see that when God promises to do something, He can do it. And just like with Joseph, God had a plan. What was His ultimate plan?
Jesus.
What's that?
Jesus.
Okay. There was that ultimate plan, and then there was the plan to build a nation, Israel. And so God had this all in mind, and Joseph was a part of that plan. And I would argue that God's got a plan for each one of us. I mean, if we think about the providence of God, the divine providence of God, He has a plan for each and every one of us. And we have to do our part, but we have to trust in God to do His. And we know that promise of God will not fail. So we certainly need to realize that there's some opportunity here for us as well. It says here in this reading that he spent some time in custody. When you think about that for a little bit, here's Joseph. He was riding high. He was in charge of Potiphar's house. Everything. And then he was thrown into prison. And it says he spent some time in custody. What do you think was going through his head? What was he thinking about? Put yourself in his shoes. What are you thinking about?
You're going to pile up all your troubles and just keep going over and over.
Yeah.
What my family did to me, what Oliver did to me. What's that?
Yeah. That would be our tendency, right? Why is this happening to me? You know, why am I here? You know, what have I done wrong? What did I do to deserve this? And so I'm sure there were lots of questions in Joseph's mind, just like us, as we think about his situation. And we think about, kind of where he's at this time. Any other comments or thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Dwight.
Yeah, one thing too with Joseph was the fact that he was in charge of Potiphar's house. But when he was thrown in prison, he still took an opportunity to still do the best he could, because the keeper of the jail put him in charge of various things. So even though things wasn't good, but he made the best out of it, because each time he was put in different positions,
Yeah.
you know. And so, that's one thing with Joseph, that he made the very best for the position he was in.
And that's a good point. I mean, no, you know, we look at his situation, no matter where he found himself, he prospered. He did well. And, you know, whether he was in prison or, you know, in charge of Potiphar's house, he did well, no matter where he was at. And, you know, that's a testimony to the faith that he had in God. And we see that. Circumstances didn't dictate his faith. And that should dictate our faith as well. But what can happen to us sometime? If we think about Joseph being there in prison, as we learn later, 2 years. I mean, think about that. He was in prison for 2 years for God. And so, you know, we think about his circumstance. How would we react to that? Drown in self-pity? Would we, you know, start questioning our faith? We would start doubting God? I mean, he was there for 2 years. And if we think about that and think about our lives, I think there's an important lesson we can learn. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, if we have strong enough faith, we're going to act like Joseph and even act like Abraham said at the critical point that God will provide.
Yeah.
So it's like Joseph didn't say that, but it's attributed by his actions that he was confident that God would provide.
Yeah.
And we can rest on that if our faith is strong enough.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And I'm sure and convinced that Joseph was familiar with all those stories about Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac and Jacob and his circumstances that he found himself in. I'm sure Joseph was familiar with all that and was able to reflect on that as he was sitting there in prison for 2 years and thinking about, why am I here? Well, I see God has a bigger plan.
So just, you know, to build on that point, one of the things I think about, do you think he ever reflected back to that dream he told his brothers? You know, because he says, hey, it's obvious that he knows dreams and interpretations of dreams are something from God. That, you know, their prophecy, their visions, whatever it is, it's something in the realm unknown. And so, you know, I just think about that fact that as he's sitting there in prison, him just thinking, you know, I had that dream that my brothers were going to bow down to me. You know, and you just see him continuing to prosper. And I just wonder sometimes if that dream helped him to stay positive and to be a man of good character and really a man that showed leadership qualities, because he knew eventually God was going to put him in a position where his family and his brothers and, you know, everything was going to bow down to him. So I don't know, you know, he seems to know this is a godly characteristic or a godly gift, and he had these dreams previously. So I don't know if that helped to guide him and helped to keep his head in the right direction.
No, I think you're onto something there, because we'll find out later in, I think it's chapter 41, that he reflects on that very thing, what happened to him and how he got here. So let's continue reading. Let's read a few more verses here. In starting in verse 9, it says, So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, In my dream there was a vine before me, and the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you. Please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh. and so to get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that should have put me into this pit. Again, going back to Dwayne's point, he obviously was thinking about how he got there. I mean, wouldn't we think about that? How did I get here? How did I end up in this place? And he certainly reflected on that. There's no question about it. And it says, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream, and there were 3 cake baskets on my head. In the utmost basket there were all sorts of baked foods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. On the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday. He made a feast for all the servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among the servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Pharaoh had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, notice, but forgot him. So when we think about this intersecting point that we talked about earlier, what's kind of the summary of the dreams and the interpretation? What can we learn from those? Yeah, Alan, go ahead.
Well, this dream has carried a lot, because this is going to position Joseph in the position to bring his brothers and sisters when they come in to form there and get ready. Of course, they're going to put in slavery, and for the church to be established down there.
Yeah. Again, the bigger plan, when we start seeing the bigger plan of God here.
Well, just read there. That's a simple thing.
Yeah. Well, we see Joseph being able to accurately interpret and predict what's going to happen. Did it come to pass? It did. How will that play out in the future? Fast forward to chapter 41. Who has the big dream? Pharaoh. Okay. And so here what Joseph had interpreted in these dreams and what had actually come to pass did. It was factually right. It was accurate. And here Pharaoh in chapter 41 has this dream, and Joseph is able to be brought to the table. The cupbearer actually remembers it after 2 years of sitting there and languishing in prison. And who knows what he was thinking about. But we know that he had some reflections about how he got there from these passages. So, any other thoughts or comments on that? Okay. So how would we summarize the dream of the cupbearer and the chief baker? What were their dreams?
Each of them had to do with the number 3, right? So 3 vines, 3 baskets. Each of them had to do with food being consumed. One of them was being consumed by the Pharaoh, one of them was being consumed by the birds. And so Joseph interpreted him accordingly, right? That, hey, 3 days, Pharaoh's going to drink from your cup again. 3 days, Pharaoh's going to kill you because it's the birds eating your food and it's not fair.
Yeah. So again, we see, they didn't understand these dreams. Joseph was able to interpret them. How? By God. That's who he gave the credit for, right? Was God being able to give him the ability to interpret these dreams. And notice, when we think about verse 14, it talks about, only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so to get me out of this house. Get me out of here. remember me. But what happened? I mean, that was Joseph's only request to the cupbearer. But what happened? We learn in the end of the chapter he forgot about it. Until when? Until Pharaoh had his dream in chapter 41. So that's where we're at right now. Let's look at some more verses here in chapter 41. It says in verse 1, it says, after 2 whole years Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke, and he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent to call for his magicians of Egypt and all his wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. And so we think about this for just a little bit, and we think about these troubling dreams that Pharaoh had. Where did he go to try to get help? Where was his source of help?
His magicians, magic.
His magicians, his wise people, right? And were they helpful? They couldn't help him. They couldn't interpret these things. They didn't know what they meant. And so there was this conundrum with these wise men that could not answer or tell Pharaoh what these things meant. And so there was kind of a standstill. And it says in verse 9, it says, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with me, his servants, and put me and the baker into custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretations. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us and gave us an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted it to us, it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So now he remembers. 2 years later. And so, was this accurate? This was an accurate recounting of what happened, right? They had dreams. Joseph interpreted it. Notice it says, a young Hebrew was there. He didn't even mention Joseph's name. So, go ahead, Alan.
Well, don't you think this is God's doing what he does with Pharaoh and with the dream? It's all in his plan. What's going on here? If it didn't, things wouldn't have added up what it did at the end of Joseph's life. It's planned by God. They said it takes 2,400 years for Genesis.
Yeah.
That is as long as 2000 Christ was born to where we are. That's a long time.
Yeah, I think the first 12 chapters in Genesis, I believe, is like almost 2,000 years. It's kind of hard for us to realize that much time passed.
God is very patient.
Yeah. So there's a plan, right? And we think about that song that we sing. It says, "In His time." Right? And so we look back in our passage here. We see, after this advice from the cupbearer, recalling that this young Hebrew Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. Notice it says out of the pit. What do you have in your mind when you think about that? The pit. Doesn't sound pleasant, does it? I mean, when I think about that, when Joni and I were in the United Kingdom, we took a tour of the London dungeons, and there was this pit. It was basically a hole, and they just threw people in there and covered it and just left them there. And so I have that image in my mind when I think about
You
the
see
pit.
any bones?
What's that?
Did you see any bones?
Any what?
Bones? in
No,
the pit?
no, I didn't. I think I cleaned those up before we got there. But you know, certainly, you know, when we think about the pit, this was not a pleasant place. But he was taken out of the pit, and when he had shaved himself, can you imagine what he looked like after 2 years in the pit? Long beard, long hair. Probably didn't smell good. And it says that he shaved himself, changed his clothes, and he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have had it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph said to Pharaoh, it is not for me in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So, again, we think about Joseph. Here he is in this pit, been in this prison for 2 years, gets brought out, cleaned up, brought before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, hey, I want you to interpret this dream. What do we learn about Joseph? Still has faith. After 2 years in prison, he still has faith in God. What does he say? It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Again, giving credit to God. And so we see that great faith in Joseph here. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dreams I was standing on the banks of the Nile. And then, you know, we see that Pharaoh recounts this whole story to Joseph. If you jump down to verse 25, Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of the Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Who's in charge? God. You know, I'm going to tell you what God is about to do. You're not in charge, Pharaoh. This is how things are going to roll, right? And he says, the 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good years are 7 years, and the dreams are one. And the 7 lean and ugly cows that came out after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty years blighted by the east wind is also 7 years. It is, as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Then there will come 7 years of plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land. The famine will consume the land. The plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow it. For it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dreams means this thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. And then notice Joseph just doesn't leave him hanging, right? He gives him some very wise advice about what he should do about it. He said, now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during these 7 years of 7 plentiful years. That's basically, what, 20% of everything that's produced? Throw it in the storehouses, right, to prepare for this. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store it grain under the authority of the Pharaoh for the food in the cities, and let them keep it. The food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt. so the land may not perish through the famine. How bad is this famine?
Nothing
I mean, have they seen famines before? It says here that it's going to be very severe. Okay? And so Joseph lays out a plan for Pharaoh to be able to prepare for this. So what ends up happening is, Joseph gives this advice, and he ends up, what happens to Joseph?
He's the making the man what he suggested.
He ends up becoming the statesman, right? Second in command in Egypt. He rises to power. Here he was in the pit, not very long ago. And within the same day, he's all of a sudden elevated to being one of the princes of Egypt, right? And so he's in charge of this preparation that we learn about here. And, so as we think about, this whole example here with Joseph, if we look at Genesis 50, I'm going to fast forward to Genesis 50 and verse 20. It says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it good to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." So if we fast forward and we think about the bigger plan and the providence of God, where is Joseph at in his journey? He's part of it. He's part of the divine providence of God to be able to preserve his people and to protect them from this very severe famine that's going to come. Where is his people? Yeah. He's going to bring them into Egypt and protect them and feed them during this very severe famine. And then we get into Exodus and that whole situation there. So, any other comments or thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Casey.
So, if none of this would have ever happened, his brothers wouldn't have thrown him to death, where would Joseph be when the famine comes? I think we spend so much time just getting angry with people and things. I mean, when he got out of prison, he could have been severely angry with that country. He could have been angry with his brothers. Sometimes I think we lose sight of the ultimate goal from God and his life. We waste so much time just being angry at our circumstances instead of just looking at the end goal.
That's a good thought. 2 years in prison, what was he thinking about? I mean, a lot of people would have stewed on their anger, right? And boy, I'm going to get them back. When I get out of here, I'm going to figure out some way to get them back, right? We don't see that from Joseph. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, all the time that there's in Egypt, that's when they became the mighty nation that they was.
Yeah.
During that time in Egypt.
And Joseph was part of that.
They was part of that.
Yeah. Just another cog
They
in the
just had
wheel.
one Pharaoh change, didn't
What's that?
they? They just had one Pharaoh change. Whenever the Israelites, the Jews fell off favor when in bondage.
Yeah, there was, when we get into Exodus, yeah. Other comments or thoughts?
Are we going into Exodus next?
What's that?
Are we going into Exodus next?
No.
So we read in Genesis 37 that Joseph was 17, and we read when he's elevated to power that he's 30. So I mean, we get a pretty succinct timeline there, 13 years that had passed where he was sold into slavery and he was head of Potiphar's house and he was in prison and, all of those things. And again, just thinking about how bitter you could be if something happened like that and it had occurred to you for 13 years and you just don't see an end to it. We see God's plan and it took some time, but Joseph stayed faithful all of those 13 years.
Good point. 30 years old. I mean, think about it. And where he was at. Yeah, go ahead. I think you should.
Oh, no, I'm supposed to say the same thing Dwayne said.
Okay, all right. Awesome. Thank you. We'll next week's lessons are in the back. You won't get one on the way out. Appreciate it.